Today on the Dig In podcast, I'm joined by Dr. Matthew Lynch, Old Testament scholar at Regent College, to ask a question most people never stop to consider. Open your Bible and you'll find something strange. Israel's supposed to worship one God, yet the pages keep mentioning others, rival deities, foreign powers, gods with names. So what happened to them? Where'd they go? The standard story says Israel only landed on one God late, somewhere in the wreckage of exile. But Dr. Lynch says that story's wrong. And he found the proof hiding inside a single rare Hebrew word buried in the book of Isaiah. In this episode, we trace how the gods of the ancient world were stripped of their status, demoted, and silenced. How the prophets refused to even call them gods. How the temple, the priesthood, and the throne were all bent toward one confession. And how the disappearance of those gods sets the stage for everything the Bible says comes next. This is the story of how the many became one and how it changes the way you read the entire Old Testament. Dr. Matthew Lynch is here, and the gods are about to vanish. Now it's time to dig in. Welcome, everybody, to the Dig In podcast. I am your host, Pastor Johnny Ova, and today, our guest, Dr. Matthew Lynch. Dr. Lynch, thank you for joining us today.
It's good to be here. Thanks for having me.
So when most people open up the Old Testament, they assume that it teaches there's one God and always has been. We get in that mindset of, this is the way it is, this is the way it was, this is the way it always was, this is the way it always will be. And so they have this mindset going in. But the text itself keeps mentioning other gods. What is actually going on here?
Yeah, well, you've sort of hit the nail on the head in terms of the complexity of even asking that question, because when it, like, you have to sort of delineate between do the writers of the Bible think there's one God, and have they always thought that? Like, all the writers, if you polled them, how many deities are there?
Right.
Would they all say one? And delineate between that on the one hand, and on the other hand, the obvious fact that Israel itself as a people worshipped multiple gods at different times, and were not always worshiping one God or believing in one God, because, for various reasons, they were tempted to follow other gods. I mean, they're in an area where, if you think about the land of Israel, it's a land that is dependent on rain for survival. Right. And when the rain's not coming, Baal is a really attractive option, because Baal is the storm deity. And so whether it be a fertility deity or storm, those basic needs often bring out the desire for other deities. So Israel, as recorded in the Bible, certainly worshiped other gods. The debate, however, among scholars and people who think about the Bible is usually whether biblical writers thought there was only one God, and have they always thought that?
I think it breaks down in a couple things for me. It's the questions I get asked a lot. All right, so let's say that in the Old Testament, it's pretty clear that the Israel believed in other gods, or at least thought there were other gods existing. So the question is, does their belief validate that other gods exist? Does it, just because they believe that these other gods were real, are they really real? Is there one God? Because when you kind of tote the line through the rest of the Bible, Old Testament going into the New Testament, it seems like there is this thought of, well, there is only one God, and his name, in the sense of deity, not going to false gods, which, false mean fake or other. Is this monolatry? Is this just... so there's like this big tug of war, like this big twisted up web that is
exactly.
Yeah,
because and you've, like, some of the terminology might be helpful. So you mentioned monolatry, which is the idea that Israel thought, okay, we should only worship one God, but other gods might exist. As for the nations, each walks in the way of their own God, but we will walk in the name of the Lord our God. So that verse might reflect, if you took it in isolation, an idea that, the biblical writers and Israelites themselves were like, other gods might exist, but hey, we're supposed to be focused on Yahweh and him alone. So that's monolatry. Henotheism is another way of sort of saying the same thing, the belief that you're to be committed to only one God. And then there's monotheism, which is not only that we should worship one God, but that only one God exists, metaphysically. So that's a different thing. And then there's polytheism, which is a belief in multiple gods. And then there's even, like, kind of funny words like sumo-deism, which is the belief that, you have let's say you have a big pantheon, but really all those other gods are aspects of the one God. And so they're kind of like, manifestations of one God. And so some people would argue that later on the Assyrians kind of dabbled in this sumo-deism or something
Interesting.
like that. So there are other terms. And, one funny thing too is like even a term like atheism, which to us like means you don't believe that any God exists, had a different valence. Like if you in the first century AD, because the Romans accused Christians of atheism, because for them, like participating in the life of the gods was a civic responsibility.
Right.
So if you don't frequent the temples, you're atheistic in the sense that you don't do the social thing that you're expected to do, like what a good Roman should do. And so you must, you show a sort of disregard socially for the gods, therefore you're an atheist. So
Right.
even some of those terms, like what they meant historically, has changed. And so the terminology is kind of important in this discussion.
Right. So fascinating how the words change, mindset change. And again, when you break the bubble of like what I've been taught my whole life and go, oh man, this whole other world exists, it really adds just so much depth, at least to me, to the scriptures, the stories, and what the words meant, things like that.
And even a term like so the term that gets translated God in the Old Testament is Elohim, or sometimes it's El, which is the singular form. Both of those, like the plural and the singular, get rendered God because it's clear in a lot of most circumstances that it's referring to Israel's God. But the term Elohim in Hebrew that gets translated God has a wide semantic range, wider than we normally think. Like it could refer to angels as Elohim. It could refer to Yahweh, the God of Israel, as Elohim. And it could refer to, when Samuel is summoned up by the witch of Endor.
Right.
So, Saul sees an Elohim coming up in that circumstance.
Interesting.
And so it's everything from your deceased ancestor to the one God, Yahweh. So when we ask a question like, did Israel think other gods existed? It's a little bit confusing because they had such a wide range of meaning for that term that gets translated God. It would be like asking, maybe something more accurate, like akin to that would be like, do you believe in a divine realm with divine beings? Do you believe in divine beings? Maybe that would be the closest thing. In which case, most Christians would say, I believe in multiple divine beings like angels and even on the malevolent side, demons and God. So like those terms also have a different like kind of value when we read them in the text and we just see God, we might have certain connotations.
Yeah, well, I have some questions around that because it seems to me that the divine beings' names are just renamed to almost make people feel a little bit better about what in some cases about what we're talking about, because it's like I don't want to define this as God, so let's call it an angel, so stuff like that, or a demon. But so there is a standard story that most scholars tell about how Israel arrived at this belief in one God, because we just spoke about, again, multiple, it seems like they believed in multiple, at least divine beings here. And again, most scholars tell the same story. Can you walk us through the consensus version first of what most people believe? And then we'll talk about why your work pushes back on that consensus a little bit.
Sure. Yeah, it's always dangerous to talk about a consensus because, like you have to have a sort of like 40,000 foot view on it. But insofar as like I've researched this and talked to people, I think the general consensus is something like this. When you go back to, let's say, late Bronze Age, so this would be like the time Israel's coming into the land of Canaan. The writers of the Bible and ancient Israelites themselves believed in multiple deities. That's the standard consensus. And maybe they thought that Yahweh had a wife named Asherah, and there are other deities out there that exist and have their legitimacy. Not only that, so Israel might have like revered multiple gods, and they might have believed that other gods had their sort of domain over other nations, and each nation has its sort of boundary specific deity. The Ammonites in the land of Ammon and the Moabites and the land of Moab and so on. And that this, and let's say at a later point, you had more kind of strident Yahwism. That's the kind of next phase people talk about, where people, biblical writers and prophets and teachers in Israel started teaching that not only it's not just that we kind of think highly of Yahweh, but Yahweh is the only one we should worship.
Right.
So that's that kind of henotheistic stage we talked about earlier. And you have like the standard kind of moment for that would be like Elijah's contest with the prophets of Baal. If Baal's your God, then show by lighting this altar on fire. But if not, then Yahweh's going to reveal it, and Yahweh shows that he has power in the land. And so and then that stridency is accompanied by this sort of violent outburst against the prophets of Baal and Asherah in that scene. And so it's accompanied by a kind of zeal.
Right.
And often monotheism is, once we get there, is thought of as this kind of zealous impulse and a rejection of all others. So there's that like strident Yahwism, but other gods might still exist. And then the moment when Yahwism morphs into, or strident Yahwism morphs into monotheism, is usually thought to be the exile. And that's because in the exile, you have texts from the middle part of Isaiah 40:55, that say things like, you have Yahweh saying, I am, and there is no other. There is none besides me. There is no other God besides me. And so that's the kind of like smoking gun that monotheism hunters are often looking for, is that like explicit statement that affirms Yahweh and denies all the other gods. And then the thought is, in exile, Israel is out among the nations. They're scattered. They're outside their land. They're outside the sort of confines of maybe nationalistic, land-focused thinking. And they saw God's the God of all the nations. And in fact, he's the only God. And all the other idols, all the other gods are just fraud idols that are made out of wood and stone.
Right.
And so then the thinking is that in the exilic period, this takes shape. It formulates into a theological belief, and that kind of wins the day eventually. And by the time they come back from exile, they're basically reformed monotheists. And that holds firm, throughout the history of Judaism and then in Christianity. So that's the kind of standard scholarly line.
All right. So now, how does your work push back against that? And where do you feel, in your opinion, that the story gets it wrong?
Yeah, I think it gets it wrong at several points. First of all, in the idea that, first of all, in how it conceptualizes monotheism in the first place and what it demands in order for people to say, yeah, there it is. So if your criteria for discerning monotheism includes only includes the idea that you have to have a denial clause, like there is no other God, then you're going to say basically, a few texts from Deuteronomy, mostly Isaiah 40:55, and maybe a few other texts. Those are the only places we have it. And so it's this like thin layer on the Bible. And I would say that kind of fundamentally gets wrong the way that the Bible monotheizes. So if you think of it as a verb, like doing the work of distinguishing Yahweh as categorically supreme and unique, there are a lot of ways that happens in the Bible. And so I would say that there's a whole range of types of monotheistic rhetoric and language in the Bible, and it doesn't all behave and act the same way. So as an example, Genesis 1, which, to be fair, a lot of scholars put in the exilic or post-exilic period, but I'll just give it as a sort of different way. It's a story of creation, obviously, where you have things that are often divinized in other cultures, like the heavenly lights, like in Genesis 1, they're called the greater light and the lesser light, the sun and the moon. The deeps are often divinized. You have reference to the sea monsters. But all of these are simply things God created and delights in. And there's no, in other words, the other divinities are not given a place at the table. So they're rhetorically denied entrance into the sort of worldview picture created by Genesis 1. Another way that monotheizing happens, which is a little counterintuitive, is sometimes it brings references to the Elohim, the other gods, into the picture, to show that they are A, created by God, and B, that they are summoned to worship and give honor and glory to God. And so worship him, all you Elohim, all you heavenly hosts, and so on. So the Psalms will sometimes do that. Nehemiah 9 references this as well. And in those cases, the other Elohim are utterly subordinate in the sense that they're revering, extolling, and giving praise to God. And those texts monotheize a very different way, but the result is the same in the sense that they distinguish Yahweh as categorically supreme. Another interesting example is in the book of Ezekiel, where Ezekiel is someone who, it's like he can't even use the word Elohim for those other beings. Like he's like, I'm going to use that only to refer to Yahweh. And I'm going to use all of these sort of mocking terms to refer to those other things. So like there's one term, gilulim, which is, I don't even know how it's normally translated, but it's basically like rolled up dung balls is the way of referring to other deities, or it'll refer to them as just images or idols or something like that, but never other gods.
Right.
And John Kutzko, in a really interesting study, he showed how Ezekiel is using terminology used elsewhere in the Bible to refer to other gods, but we'll say other, fraud gods or other, trash.
Right.
Yeah, like dung balls or something like that. So it's that kind of thing. So my point in all this, though, is that there's a pretty vast range of ways that the Bible monotheizes, and we start thinking about the rhetorical effect of all those texts. They're all putting God in a category of his own. And to me, that's monotheism. Is if Yahweh belongs in a class of his own and defines that class in himself and is utterly supreme, then that's like what Jews and Christians believe, because Christians and Jews also believe in other divine beings, but we don't see that as a compromise to monotheism, because Yahweh is incomparably other. And so that's what that's part of my pushback then. And then when you see that the range of texts that do this work of putting God in this categorically supreme, category, you realize that plotting a sort of developmental story where you have polytheism, henotheism, monotheism, this nice, neat trajectory just doesn't work.
Right.
And my suspicion, not my suspicion, my perspective on this is that ancient Israel flirted many times with monotheism and would sometimes fall back into idolatry or henotheism or something, or polytheism or something like that. But that we can't really plot the trajectory in nice, neat terms. And that's the thing about this scholarly view, is the desire to have a nice, neat story.
Right.
Where it all moves in one inevitable direction. And it like history just doesn't normally work that way. And I don't think it did in ancient Israel.
So your main point, to recap here, is that monotheism, one supreme being in its own separate category, can still be categorized as monotheism.
Yeah. Michael Heiser, who you may be familiar with, like he used the term species unique. And so there's a way of talking about uniqueness where we're all unique from each other. You're different from me. I'm different from my wife. We all are unique, but we're not categorically unique from each other. So we're all creatures, we're all created, we're all human. And more broadly, you could extend that out to all the entire created realm is all created derivative of God. And so to talk about categorical supremacy it's almost an impulse that biblical writers have.
Right.
To find ways of giving language to this deep conviction and experience that this God is utterly unlike any other. And they're not all sitting there with, kind of a theology book open in front of them saying, I'm going to be really careful here to be like studiously monotheistic in what I say. It's more of a worship impulse. It's more of a impulse to praise God by celebrating through story, song, and otherwise how this God differs differently.
Right.
So, yeah.
Interesting. Your book starts with a a single strange clue, a rare Hebrew word that shows up far more in Isaiah than anywhere else. What was that word, and what did you notice about this?
Yeah, so it's a similar phenomenon to what I talked about in Ezekiel, where first Isaiah, so Isaiah 1 to 39 is usually dated by scholars to the pre-exile time. So before Israel went into exile during the Babylonian period. And there's a term there used to refer to non-Israelite deities, which is Elilim. And I think it's a deliberate play on the word Elohim, but it's related to a term meaning kind of something ephemeral and insubstantial. And it's like the technical term is a dysphemism, which is like a euphemism is saying one thing kind of cryptically by another term. A dysphemism is a deliberately mocking term for something where you don't use the term itself. And so instead of calling them Elohim, Isaiah calls them Elilim. And I think it's a mocking term to deny them the dignity of the title Elohim. And the other phenomenon that happens that term, by the way, shows up in like, I forget offhand, it's like 12 times in Isaiah 1 to 39 out of a total of about 15 or 16 times in the whole Old Testament. So it's like possibly a first Isaiah innovation, kind of made up term to get this point across.
Right.
And then there's other impulses in First Isaiah that suggest to me, okay, this section of Isaiah is no less strident in its effort to show the utter supremacy of Yahweh, but it just doesn't do it using the same language as Second Isaiah, and like, so it didn't set off all the alarm bells for monotheism hunters because they want the denial clauses. I am and there is no other. But if you have denying of the gods the dignity of the term Elohim, simultaneously with this nonstop emphasis on how Yahweh is utterly high, lifted up, supreme, exalted, and all else is brought low to the dust, to the ground, is made low before him. What are you doing when you spatially exalt Yahweh in using every possible available term you can think of, and you deny the other gods the dignity of the term Elohim? What do we call that, right? And so to my ears, that's monotheizing. That's what that's doing. And that happens pre-exile. And I think it's important then that this is an impulse. And I don't think it's new to first Isaiah. I think that same impulse goes back even earlier. And I think it goes back, it's present in almost all forms of the tradition of the Exodus story. And so it's almost like immediately Israel, in their experience of this God, wanted to find ways to say he is utterly unlike any other. Now, sometimes maybe they still believed, other gods might have existence, but they're as good as non-existent, or as they're, by comparison, they're more like a human than a god when you compare them to Yahweh. Maybe that's the case early on. I don't know. It's a little hard to get inside their minds, but I think that impulse emerges quite early, but in variegated form, because they're not philosophizing, they're not theologizing in a kind of detached way. They're not worried about the term monotheism.
Right.
So that's what makes it a little hard for us to put language to.
And I know, I guess this is why you also argue Isaiah refuses to even call these rival deities gods. Seems like Isaiah is a little snarky to him, he's got a little sharpness to his tongue as he's writing down. So he will not call them gods. He demotes them to idols. And this is what I was saying a little bit in the beginning. It seems like that there are definitely people that are on, again, Jews, Christians, that are uncomfortable with the fact that Israel worship multiple gods. So I feel like in Isaiah here, instead of calling them gods, he just calls them idols. It's like another category under. I'm just going to take these things, Baal. I'm going to take these things and I'm just going to recategorize them to make me feel a little bit better about what I'm trying to teach.
Absolutely. And I think, there are a lot of ways you can diss the gods, and that's the way that Isaiah chose.
Right.
But it's confusing for us as readers sometimes when you think, okay, Isaiah doesn't want to even use the term, but then over here in the Psalms, you have worship him, all you gods. And so I think sometimes to reconcile that, people think, okay, this must be a different phase in their religious life when they were still not monotheistic yet. And I would say, no, that's as one a New Testament scholar put it, like in those texts, it's like if you're really famous, you walk around with this whole, like, you've got your whole posse with you.
Right.
And the bigger your posse and the paparazzi around that, like the more status you have socially, right? Like if I'm saying, I'm famous everywhere I go, but I walk around and no one notices me and I don't have a bodyguard or anything, it's like, well, you're probably not that important, right? And I'm sure at your church you always have a bodyguard, right? Because
Oh,
you're
at least 3 at all times.
at least 3. Yeah.
Yeah.
See, exactly. So when you go out to the, to act in touch with the common person by going to a grocery store, for instance, you have your posse around you, bodyguards, everything, right? So it's to highlight your significance. No, but I think when we see like the heavenly hosts and the angelic beings and the gods worshiping Yahweh, it's a way of saying, like, look how big, look how significant Yahweh is.
Right.
It's not about, oh my goodness, there are other gods, so they're not monotheistic yet.
Right.
He still belongs in a class of his own.
I know you touched on, is there anything else you want to add to the rhetoric of exaltation, lifting Yahweh above everything that exalts itself, and what that looks like in the text? I know you hit on that.
Yeah, I mean, this sort of, like, I hope readers or listeners' ears don't glaze over, if that's the right metaphor. But I did a study on, like, all the terminology for high-low rhetoric, spatial language in Isaiah, and I noticed that, like, it's highly concentrated in Isaiah 1 to 39. And it doesn't drop off completely, but it drops off significantly when you get to Isaiah 40 to 55. And so then I thought, well, what is Isaiah doing with that language? What is first Isaiah doing, Isaiah 1 to 39? And I think part of what it's saying is that if you imagine exaltation as the sort of language you're going to use to talk about Yahweh's supremacy, so you're going to use up-down language. Well, how can you convince someone that Yahweh is the best, and not only the best, but like utterly unlike any other? Well, being up high means that there's no room for anyone else up there. And so all other reality then, as a result of Yahweh being up high, is constantly, when it's being judged and confronted with Yahweh, being brought low. So low language is also, like, it prevails in first Isaiah. Whereas second Isaiah, I noticed a shift then. I was like, what's the language it uses to talk about Yahweh's uniqueness? And I've already talked about the I am and there is no other. But I called it rhetoric of negation, because it's not just other gods, but all other powers are relegated to nothing before Yahweh. And it made me realize that one of the results of either spatial exaltation language or rhetoric of negation is not just upon other gods. In fact, that's less prominent than other nations. And so by paying attention to this language, we see that one of the things that Isaiah wants to nullify is any power we might give to a nation, an empire, to a military, to something like that. And so all the nations are as dust, or as a drop in the bucket, or as nothing. And so Isaiah 40 to 55 consistently uses this language of the Hebrew term ephes, which means nothing, or like something along those lines, or dust, or all these terms to talk about all other reality. So a lot of these texts that we maybe co-opt to bring into our discussion about monotheism are actually not just about gods and how many there were, but about any power. And those texts are often far more interested in trying to get Israel out of this mentality that the Assyrians or the Egyptians or the Babylonians had any kind of real impressive power.
Right.
And so it constantly cuts them down to size.
Gotcha. I guess here's the question, I guess, that most believers wrestle with. Are you describing Israel inventing monotheism over time, or describing how the texts make their case that there was only ever one God to begin, or multiple gods to begin with?
Well, there's a synergy between the two. So I would say that, okay, the perspective we read in the Bible, one way of asking this is, how representative of the average Israelite is that perspective? And it's a little hard to tell. Because I
Right.
think sometimes the writers of the Bible are prophetic in the sense that they speak against the consensus and against the people, maybe. And other times they are capturing the sort of the common worship songs and wisdom sayings of the people,
Right.
and in that sense they're representative. And so it's hard to say on the one hand, but I do think that there's something of, I don't think that, I hope I'm answering your question, so let me know if I'm not.
No, definitely.
But there's a way of, I just have to back up 1 second to
Sure.
get to this point. There's a way of talking about biblical writers among biblical scholars
Okay.
that I think is really unhelpful. And it goes something like this. Like, you have these elite biblical writers who held certain orthodox convictions, but on the other hand, you had the consensus of the people, which was heterodox and more plural form, and they were more diverse and so on. So you pit the biblical writer against the average Israelite in that sense.
Gotcha.
And I think that's really mistaken because it assumes a sort of modern way that books come about. And I think the sort of feedback loop between text and people was much more intimate, in the sense that it represents the convictions of the people, the traditions of the people passed on through time. That's not to say there weren't Israelites who believed in other gods. The Bible tells us that. We don't, that's no scandal. And I think, did the Israelites invent monotheism? I don't know. There is a example from ancient Egypt with Pharaoh Akhenaten, who in the 14th century, so this is like 1300s BCE, he did a demolition job on all the other gods except for Aten, the high sort of sun god. And so for a brief moment, Egypt kind of had monotheism. There's debate about this, whether he considered the royal family part of the pantheon, but anyway, let's assume Akhenaten was monotheistic. So, and if that's the case, then Israel didn't invent it, but they are the ones who give the sort of most studied attention to one deity's supreme uniqueness for the longest period of time. And in that sense, I think they are the ones where it stuck, whether they invented it or not.
Right.
Invented is probably the wrong term, but you get,
Yep. I got you.
Yeah.
I got you. I just got a few more questions. And again, Dr. Lynch, thank you so much for your time today. Israel's whole story builds towards the claim that this one God finally makes himself fully known, through Christ, the whole story. How does the disappearance of the gods set up what comes next in the biblical story?
Yeah, I think all this monotheistic language that I'm talking about, I think it prepares the way, not just for beliefs about how many gods there were, but about the character and nature of this God. That because Yahweh is species unique, utterly unique, then the idea that this God would do utterly unique things in history is a kind of logical conviction on the basis of this God's utter uniqueness. And so I think in that sense, like, it's not like that directly prepares the way for the incarnation, but I do think that that combined with the conviction throughout the Old Testament that God desires to be present with his people and has gone to great lengths to make that happen, those two combine to prepare the way for that. So yeah, I wouldn't say that monotheism necessarily is a sort of like direct preparation for the incarnation.
Yeah.
But I think the uniqueness of Yahweh is really the enduring factor here. And that uniqueness takes utterly unique form in the incarnation. So I think in that way it prepares for it.
Nice. And lastly, for the pastor or the skeptic listening right now, why does it matter that we get this question right?
I think there are a couple of reasons. One is when it's probably just a good discipline when presented with an overly simplistic historical schema of Israel, like for instance, of Israel being polytheistic, monolatrous, and then monotheistic, and never deviating one way or another from that. We should be skeptical because history is complex.
Yeah.
The emergence of beliefs are complex and multifactorial. And so I would just sort of encourage people to think, not to just say, oh, the scholars are all wrong. There's some truth in that, like scholarly story, But at the same time, it's way too simple. And so maybe just have a little niggling thought when you hear things. It could be any story, like the church tried to suppress heterodox beliefs in the early church, and there are all these other stories and beliefs about Jesus that are just not told. And it's like, well, it's more complicated than that. So to always have that sort of impulse, I think, is a healthy impulse, not to be skeptical of everything all the time, but to question things in a healthy way. I also think that the story of monotheism matters for the reasons I talked about earlier, that this is really about a sort of worship and adoration impulse in Israel that can open up for us when we attend to the many colorful ways that Israel kept coming back to this belief that this is a God unlike any other. And that uniqueness is not just take shape in terms of power. He can create, he can destroy nations or whatever, but also in terms of character. And if anything, it's the utterly unique character of God that Israel cannot stop singing about and praying about and worshiping, that his loving kindness endures forever, and they just can't get over that.
Right.
And so attending to the qualitative difference of Yahweh in terms of power, yes, but also his character, I think is why it matters as well.
Awesome. Dr. Matthew Lynch, thank you so much for your time today. I enjoyed our conversation. I know our audience will as well too. I'm going to link your book up. Is there any way else anybody could get a hold of you?
My Regent College website page.
Put that on there as well.
My profile on there, so you can probably connect with me that way. So
great. Dr. Lynch, thanks again. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to the Dig In podcast with me, Johnny Ova. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Follow us on YouTube, and don't forget to rate us 5 stars on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen. You can also check out more at soh.church. See you next time as we keep digging in.